the Himalayas!
Hello everyone, Dr. Polaris here. Here's a surprise bonus episode on the Yeti that I've been working on for a while. I wasn't sure when to upload it, given that people in the comments have been asking me to cover cryptids again, but seeing that my previous 2 episodes haven't done very well, I thought I may as well release it today. And you can still expect the regular Sunday video as well, with this video's paleo profile focusing on the derived mammalia forms, and the hazy dividing line between them and the so-called true mammals. Now, onto our featured presentation. It was the year 1986, and famed Italian climber Reinhold Messner was attempting to follow a centuries-old trail through the high Himalayas of Tibet. He was alone, without any guides or porters, and as the dark of night began to set in, Messner had an eerie encounter with a mysterious unknown beast. As detailed in his book My Quest for the Yeti, the mountaineer states that, quote, "Sometime between dusk and midnight, I suddenly heard an eerie sound, a whistling noise, similar to the warning call mountain goats make. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the outline of an upright figure dart between the trees to the edge of the clearing, where low-growing thickets covered the steep slope. The figure hurried on, silent and hunched forward, disappearing behind a tree, only to reappear again against the moonlight. It stopped for a moment and turned to look straight at me. Again I heard the whistle, more of an angry hiss, and for a heartbeat I saw eyes and teeth. The creature towered menacingly, its face a grey shadow, its body a black outline. Covered with hair, it stood upright on 2 legs and had powerful arms that hung down almost to its knees. I guessed it to be over 7 feet tall. Its body looked much heavier than that of a man of that size, but it moved with such agility and power towards the edge of the escarpment that I was both startled and relieved. Mostly I was stunned. No human could have been able to run like that in the middle of the night." Unquote. The large bipedal ape-like creature described in this account, and many others like it that have emerged over the last 2 centuries, has become a worldwide phenomenon and goes by the name Yeti, or the Abominable Snowman, at least in the West. A fixture of popular culture, starring in animated films by Pixar and Rankin Bass, a famous edition of Hergé's Tintin, as well as video games.
The first rejuvenating breath of freedom. With the humility of a wounded sparrow, I genuflect to my noble deliverer.
It was no big deal, dude.
Yes. After all, it was I who let you out.
Why, you brazenly avaricious, duplicitous, larcenous ursine!
Now, hold on.
One more, perhaps?
At least.
The Yeti is often depicted as a huge bipedal ape-man with long snow-white fur. It is often considered, particularly by cryptozoologists, to be a close relative of the North American Sasquatch, and a surviving descendant of the extinct Gigantopithecus. The Yeti's meteoric rise to stardom in the West began in the 1950s, as European and American mountaineers were attempting to scale the tallest peaks on Earth, and encountered local Himalayan customs concerned with mysterious hairy ape-like beings. However, the various cultures that dwell in the Himalayas regard these entities quite differently than the white-furred beast that I was more familiar with. The term Yeti is derived from the Tibetan word Yatche or Yate, meaning something like rocky place bear, but there are many different names for wild hairy men found across the region, including Tibetan Miche, man bear, and Migo, wild man. The origins of such beliefs stretch back many centuries. A creature or spirit that roughly matches up with our modern idea of the Yeti was a part of the pre-Buddhist mythology of several Himalayan peoples, with the Lepcha venerating a so-called glacier being who was also seen as a god of the hunt. Once Buddhism became the dominant religion in so much of the Himalayas and Tibet, the concept of Yeti-like entities was carried over into Buddhist cosmologies, and there are a number of tales of Yetis helping important religious figures. In Nepal, a story is commonly told about the accomplished Buddhist master Lama Sangye Dorje, who lived around 600 years ago and spent much of his time meditating in remote caves. It's said that to aid in his meditation, he had an assistant who brought him food and water from a nearby river. That assistant was supposedly a Yeti. One day, as the Yeti crossed over a fold in the upper valley, carrying water for the master, it was killed by a rockfall. When Lama Sangye Dorje finished meditating, he returned down to the valley, bringing the hand and scalp of the Yeti with him. Those Yeti relics can still be seen today in a Buddhist monastery in the village of Pangbushe, where the sharply domed reddish scalp is held in pride of place in a glass display case just inside the entrance to the monastery. While some of these creatures can be helpful, the Sherpa people identify 3 different kinds of Yeti. These include the small Rangshim-Bombo, which is said to stand just over 3 feet tall, dwells in dense forest at altitudes of 3,000 to 3,500 meters, and possesses a coat of reddish-brown fur. It is not considered harmful to humans. The next kind of Yeti, the Chuti, is more formidable, with big males said to stand over 8 feet tall, and possess darker coloured fur and live at higher elevations, while the third and most dangerous type, the Nilamo, can reach 15 feet in height and are highly aggressive, sometimes preying on both yaks and humans. These beings are also said to have backward-facing feet, are able to kidnap human beings in order to mate with them, and are capable of inflicting illness. Meanwhile, the Lepcha of the eastern Himalayas refer to their own Yeti-like entities as Chumung, and are described as powerful spirits of the forest and mountains that must be appeased, recognisable by their eerie whistling and propensity for throwing rocks at hunters. In Bhutan, people speak of the Migyo, another hairy humanoid that is deeply embedded in local tradition. A kind of nature spirit, the Migyo is used as a boogeyman to discipline misbehaving children and is capable of turning invisible, while it also possesses superhuman strength. They also carry magical items, including small satchels, without which the Migyo becomes helpless and loses all of its powers. In summation, the peoples of the Himalayas recognise a host of hairy ape-like beings that straddle the line between animal, spirit and deity, often acting as portents of ill omen and imbued with various supernatural abilities, crucial elements that are conveniently left out of Western cryptozoological accounts of the Yeti. This is done in order to make these ape-men seem like definitive animals that can be zoologically classified, which is a trend that we also saw in my video on the Australian Yowie last year. This cultural clash between Western mountaineers/scientists and local indigenous people regarding Yeti-like creatures has been occurring for hundreds of years, dating back to the early years of the British colonisation of the region. The fundamental ambiguity of the Yeti lies in the realms of perception and the approach taken to it. Is it an ape or a spirit? A bear or a mountain deity? If we look carefully, we find that traits characteristic of these beings were already present in the earliest Western sources. In his paper On the Mammalia of Nepal, while recording the absence of apes in the high Himalayas, Brian H. Hodgson reports in a footnote that my shooters were once alarmed in the Kashgar by the apparition of a wild man, possibly an orangutan, but I doubt their accuracy. They mistook the creature for a cacodemon or a rakshasa, and fled from it instead of shooting it. It moved, they said, erectly, was covered with long dark hair, and had no tail.
The face like a man baboon lost a match. Shoot him, you fool!
This is probably the oldest record in English language sources of the presence of a furry hominoid roaming the high valleys of the Himalayas, soon to become famous as the Abominable Snowman. Hodgson's report from 1838 highlights the great divide between local and Western modernist interpretations, prevalent apparently since the very beginning of scientific interest in the Yeti. While for Hodgson the wild man might be an ape, for local hunters it was a supernatural being or a rakshasa. Fast forwarding to the end of the 19th century, Scottish explorer Lawrence Waddell was among the first British observers to note that the Yeti left large mysterious footprints. In his 1899 book Among the Himalayas, he recounted that, quote, some large footprints in the snow led across our track and away up to the higher peaks. These were alleged to be the trail of the hairy wild men who were believed to live among the eternal snows, along with the mythical white lions, whose roar is reputed to be heard during storms. The belief in these creatures is universal among Tibetans. None, however, of the many Tibetans I've interrogated on this subject could ever give me an authentic case. On the most superficial investigation, it always revolved itself into something that somebody heard tell of. These so-called hairy wild men are evidently the great yellow snow bear Ursus isabelinus, which is highly carnivorous and often kills yaks. Yet, although most of the Tibetans know this bear sufficiently to give it a wide berth, they live in such an atmosphere of superstition that they are always ready to find extraordinary and supernatural explanations for uncommon events." Unquote. This very patronising way of responding to local beliefs was unfortunately very common at the time, with the Yeti urgently needing to have been a so-called rational explanation behind it, in this case being nothing more than the Himalayan brown bear. It is also interesting that cryptozoologists have not seized on Tibetan accounts of mystical white lions that dwell in the mountains. I can just imagine the theories that would claim that these big cats are actually surviving cave lions from the Pleistocene. Another early example of British scientific interest in the Yeti consists of a letter penned by a certain Mr. J.R.P. Gent, who was a forest officer of the Darjeeling Division, which was sent to Henry Elwes of the Zoological Society of London in 1915. In the letter, Mr. Gent stated that, quote, "I have discovered the existence of another animal, but cannot make out what it is. A big monkey or ape perhaps, if there were any apes in India. It is a beast of very high elevations, and only gets down to Falut in the cold weather. It is covered with longish hair, face also hairy, the ordinary yellowish brown colour of the Bengal monkey, stands about 4 feet high, and goes about on the ground chiefly, though I think it can also climb. The peculiar feature is that its tracks are about 18 inches or 2 feet long, and the toes point in the opposite direction to that in which the animal is moving." Unquote. The name Abominable Snowman was coined in 1921, the year Colonel Howard Berry led the British Mount Everest reconnaissance expedition, which he chronicled in Mount Everest the Reconnaissance. In the book, Howard Berry includes an account of crossing the Lag Parlar at 21,000 feet, where he found footprints that he believed were, quote, "probably caused by a large loping grey wolf, which in the soft snow formed double tracks rather like those of a barefooted man." Unquote. He adds that his Sherpa guides at once volunteered that the tracks must be that of the wild man of the snows, to which they gave the name Mito Kangmi, with Mito translating to man-bear and Kangmi as snowman. The use of Abominable Snowman began when Henry Newman, a long-time contributor to the Statesman newspaper in Calcutta, writing under the pen name Kim, interviewed the porters of the Everest reconnaissance expedition on their return to Darjeeling. Newman mistranslated the word Mito as filthy, substituting it with the term abominable, perhaps out of a desire to make the creature sound more frightening and marketable. From then on, this term stuck in Western popular culture. In addition, after the 1921 Everest mission, the frequency of Yeti reports increased as further attempts were made by British, European and American mountaineers to scale the highest peaks in the Himalayas. In 1921, Nicholas Tombazi, a Greek photographer and member of the Royal Geographical Society, wrote that he saw a strange creature at about 15,000 feet near the Zimu Glacier. He stated that, quote, "I was preparing my instruments and cameras for the start when my attention was attracted by shouts outside the grotto. Soon afterwards, the Sirdar and 2 of the coolies hurried to the tent with news that a man had been sighted in the valley below. I rushed out, forgetting even to put on one of my snow boots, and gazed searchingly in the direction of which Sirdar was pointing. The intense glare and brightness of the snow prevented me from seeing anything for the first few seconds, but I soon spotted the object referred to, about 200 to 300 yards away down the valley to the east of our camp. Unquestionably, the figure in outline was exactly like a human being, walking upright and stopping occasionally to uproot or pull at some dwarf rhododendron bushes. It showed up dark against the snow. As far as I could make out, wore no clothes. Within the next minute or so, it had moved into some thick scrub and was lost to view." Unquote. Later that day, Tom Bazzi made it down the valley to the area in which the creature had been seen, and found a series of unusual tracks that he claimed absolutely belonged to a bipedal human-like animal. It was mysterious footprints such as these, and not necessarily sightings of the Yeti itself, that turned the search for the Abominable Snowman into a full-blown craze. Western interest in the Yeti peaked dramatically in the 1950s. While attempting to scale Mount Everest in 1951, Eric Shipton took photographs of a number of large prints in the snow at about 20,000 feet above sea level. Shipton took 3 photographs, one depicting the tracks and the other 2 of one particular print whose size was compared by a pickaxe and a boot. The footprint had 2 distinct large toes and 3 smaller digits close together. These photos have been subject to intense scrutiny and debate. Some argue that they are the best evidence of the Yeti's existence, while others contend the prints are those of mundane creatures that have been distorted by the melting snow. Whatever was responsible for making these tracks, Shipton's photo appeared in numerous newspapers, articles, and even scientific journals, and soon many more expeditions were mounted to find the Yeti in the 1950s. In 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reported seeing large footprints while scaling Mount Everest, although both men remained cautious in their views on the reality of the Yeti. Wanting a piece of the Yeti mania and always willing to capitalise on sensationalism, the Daily Mail newspaper funded a big expedition to the Himalayas in 1954, which included hundreds of individuals. This band of scientists, journalists and climbers tramped around the mountains for 15 weeks, but found absolutely nothing convincing. The team also examined the so-called Yeti scalp from Pangboche Monastery, and had their doubts as to its authenticity. Despite this poor showing, further expeditions were mounted in its wake, including one in 1958, masterminded by rich Texas oil tycoon Tom Slick, whose name is so perfect for his role in all this that it makes him sound like a Tex Avery cartoon character. Although intended to be a bigger, better venture than all that came before, with Slick boasting that he would have the Yeti captured by the end of the year, as you can probably tell, this didn't happen. In 1959, Slick's people managed to steal a so-called mummified Yeti hand from the Pangboche Monastery, which is considered a sacred relic. Genetic testing carried out years later found that the hand was human in origin. In addition, Slick's mission had connections with the CIA, which alarmed the Chinese government. Viewing these Western Yeti hunters as potential spies, the Communist Party did not allow foreigners into the region after 1959, which generally brought the Yeti craze of the 50s to an end. Further attempts to find evidence of the Yeti's existence were still mounted in the following decades, including the 1960-61 Silver Hut expedition led by Sir Edmund Hillary, which also returned empty-handed. Cryptozoologists such as Bernard Heuvelmans held on to the theory that the Yeti may represent a surviving population of Gigantopithecus, although this huge Pleistocene ape was a specialised herbivore and almost certainly a quadruped, which makes it a poor match for the bipedal and quite carnivorous Yeti of Himalayan lore. Occasional sightings, such as that by Reinhold Messler with which I began this video, were reported every now and then, although with the advent of genetic testing in the 1990s, purported Yeti hair and other bodily remains could now be re-examined. And what were the results of these tests? That the vast majority of these samples could be traced to known Himalayan animals, such as bears, monkeys and serows. In 2013, a call was put out by scientists from the universities of Oxford and Lausanne for people claiming to have samples from these kinds of creatures. A mitochondrial DNA analysis of the 12S RNA gene was undertaken on samples of hair from an unidentified animal from Ladakh in northern India, and one from Bhutan. These samples were compared with those in GeneBank, the international repository of gene sequences, and matched a sample from an ancient polar bear jawbone found in Svalbard that dates back to between 40,000 and 120,000 years ago. Professor Brian Sykes, whose team carried out the analysis of the samples at Oxford, proposed that the samples may have come from a hybrid species of bear, produced from a mating between a brown bear and a relict polar bear, explaining the carnivorous tendencies of Yeti accounts. This view has been criticised more recently, with it being much more likely that these Yeti samples come from Himalayan brown or Tibetan blue bears, which circles all the way back to the accounts of local indigenous people mentioned earlier, who regularly incorporated terms for bear in their descriptions of Yeti-like beings. In conclusion then, if you've seen my video on the Yowie, the overall themes I've laid out here will seem familiar. The various cultures of the Himalayas acknowledge the existence of hairy, bipedal, ape and or bear-like entities that play important roles within local worldviews and are credited with mystical powers, including invisibility, power to control the success of human hunters, and to spread disease if offended. Different versions of these wild men are thought to exist across the region, going under various localized names, and frequently vary in appearance and behaviour. Some types of Yeti-like creature are seen as being quite small and relatively harmless, while others are huge, move on all fours, and are said to attack humans and livestock. Once the colonial-era British authorities heard of these traditions, they attempted to rationalise them within a modernist scientific worldview, seeing Yetis as a potential undescribed species of ape, with the indigenous accounts of supernatural abilities being dismissed or downplayed entirely to make the cryptids seem more quote-unquote believable. However, as we have seen, these mystical powers are pretty key aspects of how local cultures relate to and understand the Yeti-type entities. The Yeti craze of the 1950s, and the later fame of the beast, resembles that of the Mokele Mbembe and the Yowie, in that Western understandings of these beings are often very different from those of native people, with the white-furred hulking Yeti of popular culture having little in common with Himalayan tradition, seeing as many accounts describe creatures that are between 3 to 6 feet tall and often have dark-coloured fur. As a cryptid, the Yeti, while famous, has kind of fallen off in terms of popularity in recent decades, with younger people in Tibet, Bhutan and Nepal apparently becoming less convinced of the beast's existence than their parents or grandparents. Personally, I find the highly variable and spiritual Yeti-type beings to be far more interesting, as these have received far too little attention in order to make the Yeti into a palatable source of study for Western cryptozoologists. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode, and I'll be back on Sunday with the promised video on mammalia forms. See you again soon. Cheerio.